Their name lights up the screen, and for the first time in years, your chest does not tighten. You do not rehearse the conversation. You do not feel the old desperate pull to explain yourself, to fix the misunderstanding, to offer one more chance at being understood. You feel nothing. You set the phone face down on the table, and you know, with a certainty that terrifies you more than anything they ever did, that you will never speak to this person again. Not because you are angry, not because you are punishing them, because something inside you has completed a calculation you were not conscious of making, and the result is final. That was 6 months ago, maybe a year, maybe last Tuesday, but you remember the silence that followed. You remember how it did not feel like freedom. It felt like a funeral. And what confused you most was that you could not tell whose funeral it was. By the end of this video, you will understand the exact psychological mechanism that closed that door. You will understand why your silence terrified them more than your anger ever could. And you will understand why the grief and the relief arrived in the same breath. Because a part of you did die in the process, and the name for what killed it is far older than you think. But this story does not begin with the silence. It begins with the sound that preceded it. Years of it. The sound of a person rearranging their own perceptions so that someone else's cruelty could be reclassified as misunderstanding. You remember the negotiations you conducted inside your own skull? The way you translated their coldness into stress, their manipulation into insecurity, their contempt into unresolved childhood pain that, if you could just love them correctly, would finally heal. Carl Jung mapped the architecture of this collapse across 4 of his most penetrating works. What he found was not a story about patience running out. It was a story about a psychic structure reaching the mathematical limit of its own one-sidedness, and the violent correction that follows when nature demands the bill. The mechanism has a name, and the name is older than psychology itself. Here is what people never understand about the way it ended. It was not the worst thing they ever did. You survived the explosive arguments, the gaslighting that made you question your own memory, the betrayals that cracked the floor of your trust so completely you had to rebuild it from underneath while still standing on it. You survived all of that. You forgave all of that. You found reasons, good reasons, reasons that cost you months of interior negotiation to stay. And then it ended over something microscopic, a dismissive wave of the hand during a conversation you thought was going somewhere, a slight shift in their tone when you asked a question that mattered to you, a casual sneer so brief that if you mentioned it, they would deny it ever happened, and you would have no evidence. You never had evidence. That was the design. It might have been a Tuesday. It might have been a Sunday afternoon, the kind of grey, unremarkable day that should not contain anything permanent. You were mid-sentence or mid-thought or mid-reach, and something in their face told you that the person sitting across from you had never once, in all the years you had been performing this exhausting labour of translation, actually been listening. Not that they failed to hear you, that they had decided, perhaps long ago, that nothing you said warranted the effort of genuine attention. And that decision, visible for half a second in the flicker of their expression, was the gram of weight that broke the architecture. In that microscopic moment, something massive collapsed inside you, not a feeling, a structure, an entire architecture of belief, of hope, of willingness that had been load-bearing for years. And when it went all at once, no warning, no gradual decline, just a sudden, total absence where the trying used to be. People around you expected a scene. They expected tears or rage, or at least the visible wreckage that is supposed to accompany the end of something that consumed years of your life. What they got was silence, and the silence unnerved them far more than any explosion ever would have. Jung understood the mechanics of this collapse with a precision that modern relationship psychology has yet to match. He described what happens when the conscious attitude, the dominant orientation of the personality, is stretched beyond its biological limit. The tension of opposites, he wrote, reaches a breaking point. The energy that has been dammed up by years of forced psychological progression simply stops. It does not fade. It does not diminish gradually, like a battery losing charge. It stops, the way a heart stops. One beat, and then nothing. And the reason the final straw was something so small is precisely because the structure was already at maximum tension. The last insult did not need to be large, it only needed to exist. 1 gram of pressure on a system holding 10,000 pounds. The straw was irrelevant, the collapse was inevitable. This is where the people who call you dramatic or oversensitive reveal how little they understand about what happened. They see a tiny event and a massive response. They conclude that the response is disproportionate. They cannot see the 10,000 pounds. They were never asked to carry it. But the way your mind handled this collapse is what makes the empath's exit so uniquely devastating. Because when infinite patience reaches its absolute limit, it does not slowly fade away. It snaps into its exact opposite. Jung borrowed a word from the ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus to describe this phenomenon: enantiodromia, the emergence of the unconscious opposite in the course of time. He wrote, in Volume 6 of the Collected Works, that this characteristic phenomenon practically always occurs when an extreme, one-sided tendency dominates conscious life. In time, an equally powerful counterposition is built up, which first inhibits the conscious performance and subsequently breaks through the conscious control. Read that again in the context of your own experience. You were the patient one, the understanding one, the one who always found one more explanation, one more reason to stay, one more way to reinterpret cruelty as a wound that simply needed better treatment. Your compassion was not merely a personality trait. It was the dominant orientation of your entire psychological life. Extreme, one-sided, absolute. And Jung's law says that every psychological extreme is secretly building its opposite in the unconscious, not as a possibility, as an inevitability. The harder you push in one direction, the more pressure accumulates in the other. Your infinite patience was never infinite. It was a countdown, and every act of forgiveness, every swallowed response, every night you lay awake, reconstructing their behavior into something you could live with, added another unit of pressure to a system that was already approaching critical mass. The people who knew you as endlessly forgiving were stunned by the shift. You went from offering 1,000 second chances to offering none, from bending yourself into shapes that would accommodate their sickness, to a rigidity so total it looked, from the outside, like a completely different person had taken your place, and in a sense a different person had. Because enantiodromia is not a decision. It is not a conscious choice you make in a moment of clarity. It is a takeover. Your unconscious mind, having absorbed the opposite position for years, finally overwhelms the conscious attitude and installs itself as the new operating system. You did not decide to stop caring. Your psyche overrode your will. It seized the controls the way an immune system seizes a body under threat. Not gently, not with your permission, with the blunt, efficient force of something that has been waiting a very long time. And the absence of urgency is the part that frightens people. If you had left screaming, they could have called it a breakdown. If you had left sobbing, they could have called it pain. Empaths aren't broken, they're alchemists in progress. The alchemist's path gives you drills, Jung-based boundaries, and 3 exclusive chapter videos to turn overwhelm into clarity. By Surreal Mind, 236-page downloadable ebook, in stock. Begin now at thesurrealmind.com. You left with the calm of someone signing paperwork they had already reviewed in private. And that calm told them something their nervous system understood long before their conscious mind caught up. You were not coming back. They could feel it. Not because you announced it, or because you made threats, or because your behavior was dramatic in any recognizable way. They could feel it because the quality of your presence had fundamentally changed. You were still standing in front of them, but the part of you that had been reaching toward them, the invisible thread of psychic investment that had been sustaining the relationship from your side alone, had gone slack. And the sudden slack in that thread was more terrifying to them than any confrontation. Because confrontation means engagement. Slack means departure. This decision seemed small at the time. It was not. To sever a bond this deep, your mind had to shut down your heart entirely and hand the knife to a much darker part of yourself. In the aftermath, something inside you changed registers. You found yourself analyzing the person with a detachment that did not feel like you, not the warm, searching analysis of someone trying to understand. Something colder, something that moved through the history of the relationship like an auditor moving through a ledger, finding discrepancy after discrepancy in records that had been falsified for years. You saw their manipulations, not as wounds that needed compassion, which is how you had always framed them, but as strategies. Deliberate strategies employed by a person who understood exactly what they were doing and chose to do it anyway. You saw their apologies for what they were, not remorse, maintenance, the minimum investment required to keep you functional and available. Jung described this mechanism with a sentence so precise it should be printed and placed on the wall of every therapist's office. In Psychological Types, he wrote that the unconscious thoughts gravitate round just the most valued objects and mercilessly strip them of their value. The nothing but type of thinking comes into its own here, since it effectively depotentiates all feelings that are bound to the object. Mercilessly. That is the word doing the work. What Jung was mapping is the eruption of the inferior function. When the dominant feeling function, the function that kept you bonded, that kept you forgiving, that kept you translating their cruelty into something bearable, finally exhausts itself, the suppressed thinking function erupts from the unconscious. And because this thinking has been locked away in the dark for so long, it does not arrive as balanced, considered analysis. It arrives as a cold, primitive, surgical instrument that strips every layer of sentimental value from the person you once loved. And the stripping is total. You look at someone who used to make your heart accelerate, and you see a mechanism. Predictable inputs, predictable outputs. You can map their emotional cycles with the precision of someone who has been studying the pattern unconsciously for years and is only now being shown the data. The love bombing, the withdrawal, the crisis that conveniently appears whenever you begin to assert a boundary, the tearful reconciliation that resets the clock to zero. Again and again and again. You see it now. You see all of it. And the seeing is so complete, so unsentimental, so merciless in its clarity that it frightens you. Because the person conducting this audit does not sound like you. They sound like a coroner. Cause of death, they seem to be saying, while walking through the wreckage of years you spent believing in something that was never there. Cause of death, sustained exposure to a person who understood your devotion well enough to exploit it and was careful enough to never leave fingerprints. This is the part nobody prepares you for. Underneath your deep empathy, behind the compassion that defined you to everyone who knew your name, lives a calculating, ruthless evaluator, an architect of severance who, when activated by sufficient threat, can dismantle the emotional scaffolding of a decade-long bond in a single afternoon, and feel nothing while doing it. Jung warned that the man who recognizes his shadow knows very well that he is not harmless. Recognition of the shadow, he wrote, is reason enough for humility, for genuine fear of the abysmal depths in man. You pride yourself on your compassion, you always have. But your shadow houses a blade, and you are terrified not because you used it, but because of how easily it came to your hand when the moment arrived. They called you cold. They called you vindictive. And the terrifying part was not that they were wrong. The terrifying part was that in that moment, you genuinely did not care whether they survived your absence. What happens next, on the other side of this silence, is the part that terrifies them more than your anger ever could. There is a sickening clarity that arrives in the weeks after the door closes, and it has nothing to do with them. You begin to realize, with the slow horror of someone reviewing security footage of their own robbery, that the person you fought for, wept over, rearranged your entire psychological life to accommodate, was not entirely real, not a hallucination, something subtler, something Jung identified as the projected imago, the image of your own unlived potential, your own capacity for depth and goodness and devotion, draped over the shoulders of another person like a robe they never earned and never asked to wear. Jung wrote, in Volume 8 of the Collected Works, that complete and final detachment can only take place when the imago that mirrored itself in the object is restored, together with its meaning, to the subject. The detachment of the imagos that give the objects their exaggerated significance restores to the subject that split-off energy which he urgently needs for his own development. Notice what he is saying. The detachment is not just emotional. It is energetic. You are pouring your own psychic substance into another person, filling them with a significance they did not possess on their own, and then falling in love with the significance you had placed there. You were not loving them. You were loving your own reflection, projected onto a surface that happened to be standing in the right light. And the narcissist, the emotionally unavailable partner, the parent who could never meet you at your depth, was never the source of the magic you experienced. They were the screen. You were the projector. Every quality you adored in them, every moment of depth you thought you shared, every conversation that made you believe this person understood you in a way no one else could, was your own golden energy bouncing off a surface and returning to you in a shape that looked like another person. When you stopped projecting, the screen went blank, and the grief that followed was not grief for them. It was grief for the realization that you spent years fighting for a ghost. The person you were trying to save never actually existed. They were wearing the costume of your own misplaced devotion, and when you took the costume back, what stood underneath was a stranger, someone you did not recognize, someone you might not have chosen to sit next to on a bus, let alone rearrange the furniture of your entire interior life to accommodate, and the memories shift. That is the cruelest part. The memories you had been protecting, the good ones, the ones you kept returning to as evidence that the relationship was worth saving, now replay with different lighting. You see the same scenes, but the meaning has inverted. The night they held you was the night after they needed something. The compliment that made you cry was calculated to arrive at the exact moment your resolve was weakening. The vulnerability they showed you, the one that made you believe you had access to their real self, was itself a performance, calibrated, repeatable, delivered to the same specification every time you got close enough to the exit to see the door. This is where the weight of self-accountability settles into the body like concrete. Because if the projection was yours, then the years were yours too. The suffering was yours. The choice to keep projecting, long past the point where the evidence should have shattered the illusion, was yours. Not because you are stupid, not because you were weak, because the projection was serving a function. It was allowing you to experience your own depth at a safe distance, to feel your own capacity for love without having to claim it as your own, to be needed, which is a powerful narcotic in its own right, without ever having to ask whether you were choosing this person or simply choosing the feeling of being indispensable to someone who would collapse without you. The projection kept you in the relationship long past the point of evidence. And the evidence was always there. You saw it. You catalogued it in some quiet corner of your mind, behind a door you agreed not to open. Every red flag was filed, acknowledged, and then overruled by the part of you that could not afford to see clearly, because seeing clearly would mean admitting that the entire enterprise was built on a foundation you had poured yourself, and claiming that foundation as your own, taking back the energy, the meaning, the devotion you'd been investing in someone else's emptiness is the task that was waiting for you on the other side of the door you just closed. And the narcissist realizes this withdrawal instantly, not intellectually, energetically. They feel the projector switch off, and what follows is panic. They rage against your silence. The insults arrive first, calculated provocations designed to trigger the version of you that still cared enough to defend yourself. They call you selfish, heartless, unstable, cruel. They rewrite the history of the relationship in real time, casting themselves as the victim of your sudden and inexplicable abandonment. They tell mutual friends. They send the paragraphs. They show up, sometimes literally, at the places you used to meet. And all of it, every word, every accusation, every late-night text message dripping with manufactured outrage, is aimed at one objective. They need you to respond, not because they want reconciliation. They need your reaction because your reaction is proof that they still exist inside your psychological world. Your anger was sustenance. Your frustration was confirmation. Even your tears were evidence that the connection still flowed in their direction. They could survive your rage. What they cannot survive is your indifference. Jung described this phenomenon through the concept of participation mystique, the unconscious psychological identity between two people. When one person has been supplying the psychic energy that sustains the other's inflated self-image, the sudden withdrawal of that energy is not experienced as a breakup. It is experienced as an existential threat. The empath was not just a partner. The empath was a mirror. And when the mirror withdraws its reflection, the narcissist is left alone with the one thing they have spent their entire life avoiding, their own shadow. Your silence forces them to look at themselves without the buffer of your projected goodness softening the image. And what they see, or rather what they refuse to see, is what sends them into the spiral of accusation and blame. They may recruit allies. They will tell the story of the relationship to anyone who will listen. But the story they tell will be unrecognizable to you. In their version, they are the one who tried. They are the one who was blindsided. Your years of patience, of accommodation, of absorbing their dysfunction like a sponge, will be edited out entirely, because the story they need to believe is the story in which you are the villain. And they need this story the way a drowning person needs a plank of wood. Without it, they sink into the one truth their entire personality was constructed to avoid, that they drove away the only person who was willing to see them as more than they were. The fury is not about you. It was never about you. The fury is the sound of a psyche that has been forced to confront its own emptiness and has chosen to rage at the person who removed the curtain rather than face what was hiding behind it. And here is the part that will test every ounce of resolve you have. They are not fighting for your love. They are fighting for your reaction, because your reaction is food. Your emotional energy, whether it arrives as love or as anger or as guilt, feeds the same mechanism. The only response that starves it is the one you have already chosen: silence. Your silence is not cruelty, though they will call it that. Your silence is the withdrawal of a resource they had come to treat as their birthright, and the discomfort they feel in your absence is not heartbreak. It is hunger. The hunger of a system that depended on your emotional labor for its survival and has suddenly been cut off from the supply. This is why you must protect the silence at all costs, not as a weapon, as a boundary. the first real boundary you have ever drawn, with the full weight of your psyche behind it. But protecting it requires surviving the final grief, and the final grief is not for them. If you are waiting for the relief to arrive clean, it will not. The guilt you carry in the aftermath of the door closing is one of the strangest psychological experiences a human being can have. You do not feel guilty for leaving. You feel guilty for the absence of guilt about leaving. People expect you to be a wreck. They expect the tears, the second-guessing, the sleepless nights spent wondering if you made a terrible mistake. And some of that arrives. It arrives in waves, mostly at 3 a.m, mostly in the form of a memory that was real once, before the projection distorted it. But underneath the waves is something solid, something that was not there before, a stillness that does not waver when the grief passes through it. And the people around you, the friends, the family members, the well-meaning observers who watch the relationship from the outside, will offer you the language they have available. They will say you are better off. They will say you dodged a bullet. They will say time heals. And you will nod because the truth of what you are actually experiencing is so strange, so layered, so far outside the vocabulary of conventional breakup wisdom that explaining it would take longer than living through it. Because you are not grieving a person. You are grieving an identity, the identity of the one who stays, the one who holds things together, the one whose love is strong enough to redeem even the most damaged person in the room. That identity kept you alive in certain ways. It gave you a role, it gave you a purpose, and now the role is vacant, and the purpose has dissolved, and you are standing in the open air of your own life without the scaffolding that used to tell you where to stand. Jung understood this stillness. He knew it was not peace, not yet. It was the stillness of a psyche that has completed an amputation and is now learning to live with the phantom sensation of a limb it chose to remove. In Volume 17, The Development of Personality, he wrote that the development of personality is at once a charisma and a curse, because its first fruit is the conscious and unavoidable segregation of the single individual from the undifferentiated and unconscious herd. This means isolation, and there is no more comforting word for it. Isolation, not loneliness, which implies someone is missing and could return. Isolation, which implies a position you have chosen and must now inhabit with open eyes. The door you closed was not just a door on a relationship, it was a door on a version of yourself. The version that believed love meant absorption. The version that mistook self-sacrifice for devotion. That version of you is gone. The version that could tolerate any wound, as long as the person inflicting it occasionally said something that sounded like tenderness. And you are mourning not the person you left behind, but the person inside you who had to die so that the door could close at all. This is individuation, not the gentle affirming process that popular psychology has made of it. The real version, the one Jung described as a segregation from the herd, a painful, necessary amputation of the relational self, the self that defined itself entirely through connection to another, so that the deeper self, the sovereign self, can finally take its first, unobstructed breath. You did not become cold. You became differentiated. You did not abandon them. You reclaimed the energy you had been pouring into a projection and redirected it toward the only person who was ever supposed to receive it, yourself. And the reclamation is not comfortable. It does not feel like self-love in the way that the internet uses that phrase. It feels like sitting alone in a room that used to be full and discovering that the room is not empty. It is full of you, full of the parts of yourself you outsourced to another person because you did not believe those parts could survive inside your own skin. Your capacity for devotion, your capacity for patience, your capacity to see the best in someone even when they have given you nothing but evidence of the worst. All of that energy is still alive. It just has nowhere to go except inward, and inward is the one direction you have been avoiding for years, because inward is where the grief lives, and the grief is not small, and there is no one left to absorb it for you. The door did not slam in a fit of rage. It closed because the building on the other side burned to the ground, and you were the last one still standing in the smoke, waiting for someone to help. You rebuild something that was never yours to rebuild. You do not owe anyone an explanation for the quiet on this side of it. The silence that terrified them is the same silence that is, for the first time in years, allowing you to hear your own voice. Not the voice that managed their emotions, not the voice that translated their cruelty, not the voice that negotiated endlessly with its own perceptions so that someone else could remain comfortable. Your voice, unmediated, unaccommodating, sovereign. You did not abandon them. You simply refused to participate in your own destruction any longer. And if the grief and the relief are still arriving in the same breath, that is not confusion. That is the precise sensation of a psyche that has finally chosen itself. In the alchemist's path, perception training for empaths, you'll turn overwhelm into wisdom with practical drills, Jung-inspired boundaries, and step-by-step perception training. This guide includes 3 exclusive chapter videos to deepen each lesson. Written by Surreal Mind, 236 pages, beautifully designed 8.5 by 11 downloadable ebook, in stock now. Start your training today. Feel deeply while thinking clearly. Get The Alchemist's Path at thesurrealmind.com.